Alrighty guys, welcome back. So this is the second video in the series on the inguinal canal and basically the walls of the abdomen, descent of the testes, all that kind of stuff. If you didn't watch the first video, I would recommend watching that again, just so that you are a little bit more familiar with the terms that we're going to be using here, and you can kind of picture the inguinal canal a little bit better than what I'm going to explain in here. This is just going to continue on, and so now that we know the basic structure of the inguinal canal, I want to discuss the descent of the testes and how that really plays a role in forming the inguinal canal, and basically explain this whole process. And it should hopefully cement the idea and make everything else make a bit more sense of what's going on in the canal. I know that a lot of the time in the previous video, I kept referring to this video in order to explain how the testes actually punch through and actually make that canal happen. Before the testes actually descend, and the analogous structures in females, the canal doesn't really exist to the same extent. It's almost like a potential space because this transversalis fascia that you can see here, that's actually still covering the deep ring of the inguinal canal. So because it's covered, it's not really a true canal in a sense. You still have, as you can see here, so this is the pubic tubercle I was talking about, and you can see how the inguinal ligament here has that little loopy bit. It's got this little deficiency here where it attaches at this point, loops around, and attaches again at this point, leaving this external ring, this superficial inguinal ring. So that's still open, that's still present before the testes have descended, but the one that's up here, as you can kind of see it in this picture, the hole is actually formed by pushing into the transversalis fascia and dragging it down the canal, and that's what kind of creates this opening. All right, let's take it back a step just before we get into all of that. So the testes during development, your testes, in males, the testes, which are going to sit kind of a little bit out here. That's a terrible scrotum, but anyway, so they kind of sit out here, and they're going to have structures coming into this, into the spermatic cord. They don't actually develop down here, right? So they actually develop up here on the posterior abdominal wall, up actually near the kidneys, so quite high up. And basically during development, they actually move down through this canal and out into the scrotum here. So they develop if you remember, we were talking about the different layers of the abdominal wall. They develop in the extraperitoneal fat. All right, so you can see this kind of layer here. So this is the peritoneum, and this is the extraperitoneal fat, and that's kind of where the testes develop, except right up here on the abdominal wall. So if we do a quick recap of the structures, so most externally is skin, then we have fascia, then we have external oblique, then we have internal oblique, then we have transversus abdominis, and then we have, oh sorry, that's terrible, abdominis, then we have transversalis fascia, then we have the extraperitoneal fat, and finally we have the peritoneum. Right? So, sorry, these are just the references, by the way. So if you're liking these pictures and you want to know where I'm getting them from, this one here is from Netta, and then these two down here are both from Grey's Anatomy for Students, by Drake. Okay, so we're saying that our testes arise here, right, and that extraperitoneal fat, and they need to pass these structures in order to enter into the testes. The skin and the fascia, they don't need to pass because that's what the scrotum is made of, right? The scrotum is made of skin and then fascia, and then the testes inside it, right, with their spermatic cords. So they don't need to pass those, otherwise your testes would literally just be exposed outside of the body, which is not great. But they do need to pass these muscles and the fascia here. And so that's why the inguinal canal is important. It provides this little tunnel through which it can penetrate those layers of muscle to reach the scrotum out here. All right? Cool. So they develop up in that posterior wall and they start descending down. When they get to the deep inguinal ring, this is the first barrier where they meet the transversalis fascia, right? So they start pushing. So if you can kind of imagine it, you've kind of got the canal sits here, and the canal, if you remember, is formed by the inguinal ligament on the floor, and then those arching fibers of the internal oblique and transversus abdominis. They form the arching roof. So you do have this kind of like space here, but it's kind of covered. And so technically this would be the internal ring, but it's covered with this fascia, this transversalis fascia. So the testis gets to here, and what it actually does is it starts to push on this fascia, right? And you can imagine it if you've got like, I guess, if you've got a tube of some kind and then some cling film or some paper over the top and you start pushing on it, what's going to happen is that that fascia is going to involute into that tube and it's going to wrap around it too. So by pushing into the tube, the testes enters into the inguinal canal, forming that deep inguinal ring. And at the same time, the transversalis fascia wraps around the testes as well as its accompanying nerve and blood supply, which was the spermatic cord. And in doing that, it actually forms the internal spermatic fascia. So if we come down, I don't know if we've got it here. This is probably a better diagram to work off from now. So these diagrams as well, we were just saying before. So here's that inguinal ligament we were talking about. And this is that aponeurosis of external oblique. So you can see how that kind of arises from the inguinal ligament and can form those structures we were talking about, specifically the anterior wall. So you can see how you've got that anterior wall along there, which is going to be formed by the external aponeurosis, external oblique aponeurosis. So if we come down here, so this is what I was kind of talking about before. So this is our testes, right? And you can see, so this is the testis itself. And so on top of this, you would have the scrotum kind of sitting there, which is made of the skin and the fascia. But while the testicle itself is sitting in here, it's surrounded by all these other things, including the internal spermatic fascia, the cremasteric fascia, and the external spermatic fascia, right? So the internal spermatic fascia, that is derived from the transversalis fascia. Man, it'd be good if I learned to spell. Transversalis fascia. So it penetrates that deep ring there. You can see here the transversalis fascia that we're talking about, and it gets pushed in at this inguinal ligament and wraps around it, forming that deep fascia, right? So then it's in the canal, right? And if you remember, the fibers of internal oblique and transversus abdominis, they actually kind of pass over the top in that arching kind of form. So the testes can kind of slide underneath it in a way. So it slides underneath those arching fibers, but it does pick up a few things as it passes through that tunnel. So there will be a few little like bits of muscle. You can kind of see here that there were some joints in the between, like, so the transversus abdominis here and kind of this its tendon forming the conjoint tendon. And you can also see here with your internal oblique, there was kind of a structure bridging this at some point. But as the testis moves through, it kind of, again, similar to what we were talking about with the transversalis fascia, it pushes through those structures, and those structures kind of give way underneath it because there's that little tunnel there. And as they give way, they wrap around it again. So you end up getting this kind of muscular layer in a way, this muscular fascia intermediate, and that forms the cremasteric fascia. Now that's really important because there's this thing called the cremasteric reflex, which is, I know most guys will understand this. when the testes get cold, so for example, they're immersed in cold water or for something like that, or during arousal, those muscles actually contract, right? And as the muscles contract, because the muscles are up here, you can imagine that when they contract, they pull the scrotum upwards and pull closer to the body so that it's closer to the warmth, and they can stay warm so that spermatic production can continue. So that's a really important thing there. And so that's formed by internal oblique and transversus abdominis. Cool. All right. And then we keep moving through, and then we finally get to, so you can see the conjoint tendon here as well, which forms part of that posterior wall in the up in the lateral part of the ligament and of the canal, sorry. The external spermatic fascia is formed again, so we have that the external oblique here, which is because it's got that little hole there, it's pretty much got that hole ready to go, but there is still, you know, the body doesn't like leaving holes places, so it's going to be covered with like a thin film, a really thin part of the membrane. And as the testes kind of punch through that forms the external spermatic fascia. So that is formed by external oblique. Right? So, but because when we're talking, you can kind of see here, external oblique as a muscle ends up here, and then here it's the ligament, and here it's all tendon. There aren't actually that many, there's no real muscle fiber there. So it's not actually considered, it doesn't actually constrict, it doesn't do anything like that. It's basically just fascia. It's just that kind of connective tissue structure. So that's not involved in the cremasteric reflex. But there you go. So there's the testis, or the testy. This bit here that you can see, we call that the spermatic cord, and you can see it's carrying all those vessels and the nerve supply and things like that from when it was up in the posterior wall, kind of up here, the posterior abdominal wall. So that it takes all that with it. You've got the testis itself, and then you've also got the vas deferens and the ductus deferens and things like that. And so that's what actually carries the sperm from the testes up into the body, and then down through the prostate and through the penis and urethra. So there you go. That's the descent of the testes. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. And so the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss basically what can happen with this clinically. And the best examples of how this is clinically relevant is when we talk about hernias. And there's a thing called an indirect and a direct hernia. So if you're interested in that, stick around for the next video. As always, please leave any comments down below if nothing made sense, or if you'd like me to explain anything else, there's any other topics you want me to cover, please just leave anything in the comments below. Thank you guys.